Wolf's Lair, Wolfschanze, East Prussia. July 19, 1944. The humid air of the Prussian forest hung over the fortified complex as Adolf Hitler surveyed the situation maps with Heinrich Himmler at his side. The SS chief reported yet another concluded investigation, another eliminated communist resistance cell, another proof of the Reich's impregnable security. Hitler looked at Himmler with that unwavering certainty that had become his trademark in recent years. "Providence protects me, Himmler. 15 attempts on my life, 15 failures. It's not coincidence, it's destiny," he declared, his voice laden with mystical conviction. Himmler nodded reverently. "Mein Führer, the Wehrmacht is loyal. The party is pure. Germany is one. We have destroyed the traitors at the Reich's margins. The Jews, the communists, the defeatists. The nation's heart beats in unison with your will." Hitler smiled slightly, that tense smile that emerged when his self-belief was reaffirmed. Nazi doctrine had built an empire on a simple and brutal premise. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one empire, one leader. Dissent had been extirpated at the root. The Gestapo had hunted every suspect, every deviant, every questioner. And the military elite, the Wehrmacht, the Prussian generals of aristocratic lineage and iron discipline, were considered the regime's unbreakable backbone. They had sworn personal loyalty to the Führer. They had conquered Europe. The idea that 200 of these high-ranking officers had been conspiring for years, meticulously planning his death, plotting in the corridors of headquarters itself, was literally unthinkable to the Nazi mind. Totalitarianism did not admit the possibility of treason at the core. "Tomorrow I have another strategic meeting here," Hitler said, folding the maps. "The Americans advance in the west, the Soviets in the east, but Germany resists because Germany is one." "There is no crack in our will," Himmler agreed. "Loyalty is absolute, mein Führer. The Wehrmacht will never betray you. They are German soldiers, not weak politicians." Hitler nodded, satisfied. "Exactly. That's why we will win. The rotting democracies of the West devour themselves with debate and dissent. We are one body, one mind. It is our supreme strength." In the next 24 hours, that conviction would be shattered by an explosion that should have killed Hitler, but failed by 2 centimeters and a wooden table. And in the failure of that explosion, the true nature of totalitarianism would be revealed. Not as strength, but as fatal systemic fragility. What Hitler did not comprehend as he slept that night of July 19th was that the most meticulously planned betrayal in German military history was hours from execution. And not by communists in the shadows or persecuted Jews, but by the best generals Germany possessed. Operation Valkyrie was not merely an assassination attempt. It was living proof that totalitarianism carries within itself a lethal contradiction. By demanding absolute loyalty and suppressing any form of dissent, it becomes incapable of self-correction, even when leadership drives toward total self-destruction. While Western democracies could remove incompetent leaders through elections, parliamentary debates, and peaceful transfers of power, the Third Reich had built a system where the only form of change was clandestine assassination. And assassination, unlike voting, depends on centimeters, chance, and luck. The next day, July 20th, 1944, at 12:42 p.m., Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg would detonate a bomb 2 meters from Adolf Hitler. 4 men would die. Hitler would survive with a perforated eardrum and scorched pants. And in the 9 months that would follow until his suicide on April 30th, 1945, between 2 and 3 million additional people would die because the totalitarian system he had created did not allow him to be removed any other way. This is the story of how a regime's ideological rigidity guaranteed its own apocalyptic destruction. The mathematics of Operation Valkyrie was, from the beginning, an equation of desperation. To understand the magnitude of what the conspirators were attempting, one must understand the absurd scale of the disparity between democracy and dictatorship regarding leadership change. In July 1945, just 1 year after Valkyrie, Winston Churchill, the man who had led Britain through its darkest moments, was democratically removed from power. He lost the general election to Clement Attlee and the Labour Party. There was no coup. There was no blood. There were no show trials or mass executions. Churchill simply handed over the office, and the British state machinery continued functioning without interruption. This is the fundamental advantage of democracies: the ability to correct leadership errors through peaceful institutional mechanisms. The Third Reich possessed no such mechanism. There was no functional parliament, no free elections, no independent press, no legal opposition. The Nazi state structure was built on the doctrine of the Führer's infallibility. Questioning Hitler was not merely political dissent, it was ideological heresy and racial treason. The Gestapo and SS had spent years systematically eliminating any possibility of organized opposition. Communists were sent to concentration camps as early as 1933. Socialists and Unionists were destroyed in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. Dissident intellectuals and clergy were silenced or killed. By 1944, Germany was a society where even expressing doubt about final victory could result in summary execution for defeatism. In this context, the only way to remove Hitler was to kill him physically, and this is where the mathematics becomes brutal. Operation Valkyrie was, in fact, at least the 16th documented attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Each previous attempt had failed through a combination of bad luck, last-minute changes in Hitler's plans, or lack of close enough access. In March 1943, General Henning von Treschow, one of the main architects of military resistance, placed a bomb disguised as a cognac box on Hitler's plane during a visit to Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. The bomb was timed to explode mid-flight, bringing down the plane and making it appear an accident. The detonator failed due to extreme cold at altitude. Treschow had to discreetly recover the undetonated bomb before it was discovered. In November 1943, another conspirator attempted to detonate a bomb during a military equipment exhibition Hitler was scheduled to inspect in Berlin. Hitler canceled the visit at the last minute. Between 1943 and July 1944, Stauffenberg personally attempted at least 5 times to bring bombs to meetings with Hitler, but on each occasion conditions were not ideal. Other key Nazi figures were absent, or circumstances suddenly changed. This succession of failures was not coincidence or conspirators' incompetence. It was a direct consequence of the regime's totalitarian structure. The conspirators could not communicate openly, could not recruit broadly without risk of betrayal, could not test equipment or coordinate logistics transparently. They operated in minuscule cells of absolute trust, isolated from each other by security necessity. Each attempt had to be organized with minimal resources and in total secrecy. Compare this to the democratic process of removing Churchill. Millions of people voted openly, debates were held publicly, transition was supervised by stable institutions. The efficiency difference was astronomical. Totalitarianism had made leadership change not just illegal, but logistically nearly impossible. And yet the conspirators persisted, because the alternative was to watch Germany's total destruction. In July 1944, the military situation was catastrophic on all fronts. In the east, the Soviet Operation Bagration had destroyed Army Group Center, eliminating 28 German divisions and killing or capturing about 400,000 soldiers. In the west, the Allies had landed in Normandy on June 6th and were expanding the beachhead. The Luftwaffe was being massacred in the air. German industrial production was being systematically obliterated by strategic bombing. The military logic was inescapable. The war was lost. Each additional day meant only more destruction, more deaths, more devastation of German territory. But Hitler refused to consider surrender or negotiation. His ideology did not permit retreat. Nazi totalitarianism had been built on promises of total victory or heroic death. There was no third option in the Führer's vocabulary. The generals who formed the resistance corps understood they were trapped in a death machine that could not be shut down by conventional means. General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff who had resigned in protest against Hitler's war plans as early as 1938, had become the conspiracy's spiritual leader. Around him gathered more than 200 high-ranking officers: Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, designated to assume supreme command of the Wehrmacht after the coup. General Friedrich Ulbricht, chief of the General Army Office and architect of the Valkyrie Plan. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, military intelligence, who had used his position to protect conspirators. Dozens of colonels, brigadier generals, and staff officers. These were not defeatists or cowards. They were the Reich's military elite, men who had commanded armies, planned campaigns, conquered nations. And all had reached the same devastating conclusion. Hitler was destroying Germany, and the totalitarian system he had created made it impossible to stop him except through his physical death. Claus von Stauffenberg was not, at first glance, the obvious choice for assassin. A Bavarian aristocrat of old Prussian lineage, a devout Catholic, a poet in his spare hours, he had initially supported the Nazi rise like many officers of his generation, seeing in Hitler the restoration of German military strength after the humiliation of Versailles. But war had transformed Stauffenberg. Serving in North Africa with the 10th Panzer Division, he had witnessed first-hand atrocities against civilians and prisoners. And on April 7, 1943, a British hurricane strafed him during a reconnaissance mission in Tunisia. The wounds were horrific. He lost his left eye, his entire right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand. Doctors considered amputating his left leg. During months of recovery, while his mutilated body slowly healed, his mind reached a clear conclusion. Hitler was leading Germany to apocalyptic destruction and needed to be eliminated. When Stauffenberg emerged from the hospital in late 1943, he actively sought out the conspirators. His physical disability paradoxically made him more valuable. No one would suspect that a man with 1 eye, 1 hand, and only 3 fingers on the other would be capable of arming and detonating a bomb. And his new position as Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army gave him something precious: regular access to meetings with Hitler. The original Valkyrie plan was, ironically, a creation of the Nazi regime itself. It had been developed as an emergency protocol to mobilize the reserve army in case of internal uprising, strikes, forced laborer insurrections, or an SS coup. The conspirators planned to hijack this protocol. After assassinating Hitler, General Ulbricht in Berlin would activate Valkyrie under the pretext that the SS was attempting a coup. The reserve army would then occupy government buildings, arrest Nazi leaders, assume control of radio stations and telecommunications. Beck would assume the position of head of state, Witzleben, as supreme commander of the Wehrmacht. A new government would be formed, including former Weimar Republic politicians and respected officers. And then, crucially, they would attempt to negotiate immediate surrender with the British and Americans in the West, maintaining resistance only against the Soviets in the East. The hope was that the Western Allies, recognizing they were dealing with a post-Nazi Germany, would accept more favorable terms than unconditional surrender. It was desperate optimism, but not entirely irrational. In July 1944, the Allies had not yet definitively decided on Germany's division. The Cold War had not begun. A post-Hitler Reich could theoretically have saved millions of lives and avoided the country's partition, but everything depended on Hitler being dead when the plan was activated, and this is where assassination mechanics met the cruelty of chance. Stauffenberg attempted 5 times between January and July 1944 to bring bombs to meetings with Hitler. On July 6th, he brought a bomb to a conference at the Berghof. Himmler did not attend. Stauffenberg aborted, as the conspirators wanted to kill Hitler and Himmler simultaneously, to decapitate both the state and the SS's terror apparatus. On July 11th, he flew to Berchtesgaden again with a bomb. The meeting was cancelled at the last hour. On July 15th, he reached the Wolf's Lair and was ready to detonate, but the meeting ended abruptly before he could position the bomb. Each attempt increased the risk of discovery. Each failure drained the conspirators' morale. And each additional day meant more Germans killed, more cities destroyed, more territory occupied by the Soviets. On July 20th, Stauffenberg decided, this time, regardless of who was present, he would detonate the bomb. He could wait no longer. Time had run out. On the morning of July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg flew from Berlin to Rastenburg, East Prussia, accompanied by his adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Heften. He carried 2 British plastic bombs of 0.75 kilo each, captured and modified with acid delay pin detonators. The detonator was simple. Squeezing a pin broke an acid ampule that corroded a metal wire, releasing a spring that struck the firing pin. Detonation time, approximately 10 minutes. The conference was scheduled for 12:30 p.m. in the concrete underground bunker of the Wolf's Lair, where the explosion in confined space would kill everyone present. But when Stauffenberg arrived, he was informed the meeting had been moved to a wooden barracks above ground due to the heat. This seemingly trivial change would drastically reduce the explosion's lethality. At 12:30 p.m., Stauffenberg asked to use the bathroom to freshen up before the conference. In the bathroom, with Heften standing guard, he attempted to arm both bombs, but with only 3 fingers on his left hand and no right hand, the process was torturously difficult. He managed to arm only 1 bomb when Sergeant Werner Vogel knocked on the door, hurrying him. The conference was beginning. Stauffenberg placed the armed bomb in his leather briefcase, left the second unarmed bomb with Heften, and entered the conference room at 12:37 p.m. The conference room in the Lager Baracke barracks was Spartan. A massive oak wooden table measuring approximately 5 by 1.5 meters, surrounded by 24 officers and aides. Hitler was leaning over the table studying maps of the Eastern Front. General Adolf Hitler, Chief of Operations of the General Staff, was reporting the catastrophic collapse of Army Group Center. Stauffenberg was announced and briefly greeted Hitler. He asked to stand near the table to hear better, citing his partial deafness from war wounds. Colonel Heinz Brandt kindly made space. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the table, positioning it approximately 2 meters from where Hitler was leaning. The bomb was now inches from Hitler's legs, separated from him only by the table's wooden support. At 12:40 p.m., Stauffenberg murmured an excuse about an urgent phone call and left the room. Brandt, bothered by the briefcase obstructing his space, absent-mindedly pushed it to the other side of the heavy wooden table support. This casual, completely unconscious movement placed 10 centimeters of solid oak between the bomb and Hitler. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The explosion was devastating but not lethal to all. The detonation of 0.975 kilos of plastic explosive in enclosed space produced a peak overpressure of approximately 20 psi and a heat wave of over 3,000 degrees Celsius at the epicenter. But the wooden barracks, unlike the concrete bunker, had windows that instantly blew out, relieving pressure. And the table support, positioned between bomb and Hitler by Brandt's accident seconds before, absorbed and deflected most of the explosion's force. 4 men died. Heinz Brandt, the officer who had moved the briefcase, had his legs torn off by the explosion and died in the hospital hours later. General Günther Korten, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, died of wounds days later. General Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's chief adjutant, also died later from wounds. Stenographer Heinrich Berger died instantly. 20 others were wounded, some seriously. But Adolf Hitler, protected by the wooden support, suffered only a perforated right eardrum, superficial burns on his legs, torn pants, and multiple small wood fragments embedded in his back and buttocks. He was able to walk out of the barracks wreckage on his own, dazed but alive. Stauffenberg, 100 meters away, saw the explosion destroy the barracks. Convinced no one could have survived that, he and Heften ran to the car, bluffed their way past confused guard posts, and drove to the airfield. At 1:15 p.m., they took off for Berlin, throwing the second unarmed bomb out the plane window over the Prussian forest. Stauffenberg believed Hitler was dead. He was wrong by 2 centimeters of oak. In Berlin, at the Reserve Army headquarters in the Bendler Block, the conspirators awaited confirmation. General Ulbricht had received a cryptic message from Rastenburg. Explosion occurred, but there was no confirmation of Hitler's death. Critical hours were wasted in indecision. Ulbricht dared not activate Valkyrie without absolute certainty. If Hitler was alive, the coup would be treason with no return. At 3:00 p.m., Stauffenberg finally arrived in Berlin and burst into the Bendler Block. Hitler is dead. I saw the explosion. No one survived that. With this assurance, Ulbricht activated Valkyrie. At 3:30 p.m., orders were transmitted to reserve army units throughout Germany and occupied territories. Führer Adolf Hitler is dead. The SS is attempting a coup d'état. The Wehrmacht assumes control to maintain order. Arrest all SS officers. Occupy government installations. For brief hours, the coup seemed to work. In Paris, General Karl-Heinrich von Stauffenberg arrested 200 SS officers, including Gestapo and SD chiefs. In Vienna, army units surrounded SS buildings. In Berlin, a guard battalion under Major Otto Remmer received orders to isolate the government district. Troops occupied the propaganda ministry, cut telephone lines, established blockades. For 3.5 hours, the conspiracy controlled Berlin. Beck, Olbricht, and Stauffenberg worked feverishly in the Bendler block, issuing orders, trying to consolidate control before the truth emerged. But the truth was emerging. At 4 p.m., Wehrmacht shortwave radio picked up a transmission from Rastenburg confirming Hitler was alive and only slightly wounded. At 6:30 p.m., German national radio broadcast a brief announcement. Assassination attempt against the Führer failed. He suffered only minor injuries and will continue with his duties. The coup collapsed like a house of cards. Major Remmer, commanding troops in Berlin, had been informed by conspirators that Hitler was dead and the SS was attempting a coup. But Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, was still free in his ministry when troops arrived to arrest him. Goebbels, with diabolical genius, asked to speak personally with Remmer. "Major, do you believe the Führer is dead? I will prove he is not." He picked up the phone with a direct line to Rastenburg and handed it to Remmer. From the other end, Adolf Hitler himself. "Remmer, do you recognize me? I am alive. There has been treason in the military high command. You are now under my direct orders. I promote you to full colonel immediately." The voice was unmistakable. Remmer paled, saluted the telephone, and reversed his troops. At 7 p.m., the Loyal Guard Battalion surrounded the Bendler block. Inside the building, conspirators realized all was lost. General Fromm, commander of the reserve army who knew of the conspiracy but had not actively participated, saw an opportunity to save himself. He freed himself from house arrest where conspirators had placed him, assumed command of loyal officers, and burst into the office where Beck, Olbricht, Stauffenberg, and others were meeting. "You are under arrest for high treason," Fromm declared. He offered Beck a weapon for honorable suicide. Beck accepted, but the first bullet only wounded him. He had to fire a second time. Fromm then decreed instant court-martial for Olbricht, Stauffenberg, Heften, and Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim. Verdict: death by firing squad, to be executed immediately. Fromm was hasty, calculating. The faster the main conspirators were dead, the less they could testify about his own tacit knowledge of the plot. At 11 p.m. in the Bendler block's inner courtyard, illuminated by military truck headlights, 4 men were lined up against a brick wall. Stauffenberg, wounded in the shoulder by a shot during arrest, stood upright with difficulty. Olbricht was serene. Heften appeared dazed. Merz was pale but firm. A firing squad of 10 men formed a line. There were no blindfolds, no last cigarette, just brutal efficiency. Fromm read the sentence quickly and nodded. Heften was shot first. When rifles aimed at Stauffenberg, he shouted with his last breath, "Es lebe das heilige Deutschland." Long live sacred Germany. Bullets cut him down before he could finish. Olbricht and Merz were executed next. 4 bodies were thrown in a truck and buried in a shallow grave at St. Matthias Military Cemetery. The next day, by Hitler's personal order, the bodies were exhumed, cremated, and ashes scattered in a sewer. There should be no grave, no martyr, only oblivion. But oblivion did not come for the other conspirators. Vengeance was just beginning. Hitler had survived by pure chance, and his fury was apocalyptic. On the night of July 20th, he made a radio broadcast to the German nation, his voice trembling with mixed rage and triumph. "Germans, if I speak to you today, it is first so that you hear my voice and know that I am unhurt and well, and second, so that you may know about a crime without equal in German history. A very small group of ambitious, irresponsible, and at the same time stupid officers formed a conspiracy to eliminate me and eliminate the armed forces' high command. The bomb placed by Colonel von Stauffenberg exploded 2 meters to my right. Miraculously, I suffered nothing but scratches, bruises, and burns. I consider this confirmation of the task imposed on me by Providence. I will dedicate my life, as in the past, to my people. He then handed investigation and punishment to Heinrich Himmler, SS leader and the regime's most bloodthirsty man. Himmler understood the task not just as justice, but as opportunity. The Wehrmacht, the traditional army, had always been the SS's rival. Now he had pretext to destroy the old military elite and consolidate total SS power. The hunt began. Himmler's Gestapo moved with industrial efficiency. In the first 48 hours, hundreds were arrested. Discovery of diaries, letters, and documents in conspirators' offices and homes revealed not just the July plot, but previous attempts dating back to 1938. Each name mentioned led to more arrests. General Henning von Treschow, the man who had tried to blow up Hitler's plane in 1943, was serving on the Eastern Front when he learned of Valkyrie's failure. On July 21st, he walked into no man's land and detonated a grenade against his own chest. His last words to his adjutant: "Now the whole world will attack and curse us, but I am firmly convinced we did the right thing. Hitler is the arch-enemy not only of Germany but of the world. In a few hours I will stand before God to answer for my actions and omissions. I think I can defend with a clear conscience what I did in the struggle against Hitler." Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had peripheral connections to conspirators. He had not actively participated in the attempt, but had supported the idea of removing Hitler. On October 14th, 2 generals visited Rommel at home while he was recovering from wounds from an air attack. They offered a choice: face public trial, where his family would be destroyed by the Sippenhaft doctrine, or commit suicide with cyanide in exchange for sparing his family. Rommel chose cyanide. He died in a car on the way to the hospital, and the regime announced he had died of war wounds. He was the luckiest of the conspirators. He had a quick death and official honors. For the others, Hitler reserved exemplary punishment. He ordered creation of a special people's court, presided over by Roland Freisler, a fanatical Nazi judge known for screaming insults at defendants during trials. The trials were filmed by Goebbels' order as propaganda. The accused were deliberately humiliated, forbidden to wear belts, so pants would fall during trial, forced to wear ill-fitting civilian clothes, kept unshaven. Freisler presided in scarlet-red robes, screaming insults with deafening voice. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who was to assume Wehrmacht command after the coup, was dragged into court holding his pants with one hand, beltless. Freisler shouted, "You dirty old man," while cameras recorded the humiliation. When Count Peter York von Wartenberg tried to explain moral motivations, citing conflict between duty to state and religious obligations to God, Freisler roared, "Nonsense," and cut him off. No defense was permitted, no witnesses, only predetermined verdict, guilty of high treason, and then execution. The execution, however, would not be humane. Hitler personally ordered that conspirators be hanged like cattle. At Plötzensee prison in Berlin, an execution room was prepared with 8 meat hooks hanging from ceiling beams. Normal rope was replaced with thin piano wire. The method was calculated for maximum agony. Piano wire slowly cut through flesh while suffocating, prolonging death for minutes instead of seconds from the neck-breaking of conventional hanging. The executions were filmed. Hitler watched the films repeatedly. On August 8, 1944, the first group was executed. Witzleben, Huppner, von Hasse, Stief, von Witzleben, Bernardus, Hagen, and Klausing. They were stripped to the waist, wire was placed around necks, and they were slowly hoisted. Footage shows men struggling, choking, taking up to 20 minutes to die. Hitler considered this justice. The thirst for vengeance was insatiable. In the following weeks and months, approximately 7,000 people were arrested. Of these, about 4,980 were executed in various forms: hanging, shooting, guillotine. The Sippenhaft doctrine, invoked by Himmler, meant entire families were punished. Nina von Stauffenberg, Klaus's wife, was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Alexander von Stauffenberg, Klaus's brother who was serving in Greece and knew nothing of the conspiracy, was sent to a concentration camp. Conspirators' children were taken from families and placed in SS orphanages, where their names were changed to erase their identities. Elderly parents were arrested. Distant cousins were interrogated. Hitler's vengeance was so vast, it destroyed not just conspirators, but entire generations of some of Germany's oldest aristocratic families. Executions continued until the war's final weeks. In February 1945, Roland Freisler was killed in an American bombing while conducting a trial. But executions did not stop. In April 1945, with the Red Army kilometers from Berlin, the last surviving conspirators were killed. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who had used his position as Abwehr chief to protect conspirators, was executed by slow hanging on April 9, 1945, just 21 days before Hitler committed suicide. Theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had participated in ethical discussions about resistance, was hanged the same day. Pastor Ludwig Müller and General Hans Oster were executed in the same batch. Until the last moment, until the Reich's final hours, vengeance continued. The final mathematics was devastating. More than 200 elite Wehrmacht officers, representing decades of military experience and command, were killed in reprisals. At a moment when Germany was fighting on two fronts against enemies that vastly outnumbered it in resources, the regime chose to destroy its own military leadership elite. It was systemic autophagy. It was totalitarianism devouring itself. Bendler Block, Berlin, July 20th, 1944, 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before being shot. Claus von Stauffenberg stood in the office under armed guard, his shoulder bleeding from a shot received during arrest. Through the window he could hear Adolf Hitler's voice broadcast on radio somewhere in the building. That voice that should have been dead, silenced by the explosion he had seen destroy the barracks. But it was not. Hitler lived, spoke, commanded. And in that moment, Stauffenberg understood the truth that made everything worse than simple operational failure. It was not just the 2 centimeters of oak that saved Hitler. It was not just the last-minute change from bunker to barracks. It was not just the briefcase being moved by Brandt inadvertently. It was something deeper and more terrible. He and the other conspirators had devoted years trying to do what democracies do routinely with a vote: change incompetent leadership. But the system the Reich itself had built made this structurally impossible. Totalitarianism does not permit course correction. It demands absolute loyalty even when leadership drives toward the abyss. And any attempt at correction becomes not politics, but capital treason. The moment the bomb failed to kill Hitler by centimeters of chance, the fate of millions was sealed, because the system had no plan B. Democracies have feedback mechanisms: elections, parliaments, free press, legal opposition. When a leader fails, he is removed and replaced without destroying the state structure. But personalist dictatorships like the Third Reich built the entire edifice of power on one man. And when that man became suicidal, the entire edifice collapsed with him. There was no way to separate Hitler from the Reich because the Reich was Hitler. General Friedrich Olbricht, standing beside Stauffenberg awaiting execution, murmured to himself as he listened to the radio broadcast through the window. "We tried to save them," he said quietly. "We tried to give Germany what the British have, what the Americans have, the ability to change leadership when it fails. But the system we built does not permit salvation. It prefers death." Olbricht thought about the numbers. 200 officers involved in the conspiracy. The elite of the elite. Men who had commanded divisions, planned offensives, conquered countries. All had reached the same conclusion. Hitler was destroying Germany. And yet, they had not succeeded in removing him. Because the structure of totalitarianism is designed to prevent exactly that. Every layer of security, every oath of personal loyalty, every prior purge of possible dissent, Everything served to ensure that once a totalitarian leader assumed power, only death could remove him. And if death came by chance, luck, or external intervention instead of conspiracy, the entire regime crumbled along with him. There was no planned succession. There were no independent institutions to keep the state functioning. Only personality cult and void around it. At 11 p.m., when Stauffenberg was taken to the courtyard, his last words echoed, "Long live sacred Germany, not long live the Führer, not long live the Reich." But the Germany that could have existed if it had not built a system that made collective suicide inevitable. The Germany that Western democracies represented, imperfect, chaotic, but capable of self-correction. That Germany died in that courtyard, along with Stauffenberg. Hitler survived for 9 months and 10 days after Valkyrie. And in those 9 months, the cost of the conspiracy's failure was calculated in human lives and civilizational destruction. In the East, the Red Army advanced implacably through Poland, Romania, Hungary, finally reaching German territory in January 1945. It is estimated that 2 to 3 million people died in this period, German soldiers in lost battles, German civilians in bombings and fleeing the Soviet advance, prisoners in concentration camps where genocide accelerated in the final months, Soviet soldiers in costly offensives. In the West, the Allies crossed France and Belgium. In December 1944, Hitler launched a last desperate offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, costing 19,000 Americans killed and 70,000 Germans killed or wounded. It was a militarily indefensible operation, launched because Hitler refused to accept defeat. If Valkyrie had succeeded, this battle would never have occurred. If the conspirators had managed to negotiate surrender in the West in July 1944, Germany's final devastation could have been avoided. But Hitler lived, and his ideology did not permit withdrawal or compromise. Only final victory or heroic destruction. In March 1945, when defeat was obviously inevitable, Hitler issued the Nero Decree ordering systematic destruction of all German infrastructure, bridges, factories, power plants, railways, food stocks, to deny resources to the Allies. The order would have condemned the German civilian population to starvation and total chaos. Fortunately, Armaments Minister Albert Speer sabotaged the order, but the mentality was clear. Better Germany completely destroyed than Germany defeated. This was the logic of totalitarianism taken to the extreme. On April 30th, 1945, with the Red Army meters from his bunker, Hitler finally did what the conspirators had tried in July. Removed himself from power, but not through resignation or exile, through suicide. He shot himself in the head while biting a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun, his wife of one day, committed suicide beside him. Bodies were burned in a bomb crater in the Reich Chancellery Garden. 7 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. But the final cost was not just measured in the deaths of the last 9 months. It was measured in decades of consequences. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. The Soviet Union controlled the East. America, Britain, and France controlled the West. In 1949, the division became permanent: Federal Republic of Germany, West, and German Democratic Republic, East. Berlin was divided by a wall in 1961. The division lasted 45 years until reunification in 1990. If Valkyrie had succeeded and conspirators had negotiated surrender in July 1944, possibly Germany would not have been occupied by the Soviets all the way to Berlin. Possibly the Cold War would have had a different configuration. Possibly millions of East Germans would not have lived under communist dictatorship for half a century. These are counterfactual speculations, but not absurd. History would have been different if the wooden table had not been there. 2 centimeters of oak determined Europe's geopolitical configuration for half a century. This is the fragility of totalitarianism. Everything depends on one man, one decision, one moment. There is no redundancy. There are no independent institutions. Only a single point of failure. And when that point fails, everything collapses catastrophically. Operation Valkyrie entered history as one of the most well-documented and cinematically dramatic assassination attempts of World War II. But its true historical significance lies not in the drama. It lies in the systemic lesson it reveals about the nature of totalitarian power. The final numbers are devastating in their clarity. Date of attempt, July 20th, 1944, at 12:42 p.m. Distance from bomb to Hitler, approximately 2 meters. Killed in explosion, 4 of 24 present in the room. High-ranking officer conspirators involved, more than 200. People arrested in subsequent reprisals, approximately 7,000. Executed in purges, approximately 4,180, including family members under Sippenhaft doctrine. Duration of war after Valkyrie's failure, 9 months and 10 days until German surrender on May 8, 1945. Estimated deaths in this final period, 2 to 3 million, including soldiers, civilians, and concentration camp victims. Geopolitical cost, Germany's division for 45 years and Cold War structuring. These numbers tell the story of a political system that became structurally incapable of course correction. And in the historical contrast lies the most powerful lesson. On July 26, 1945, just 6 days after the first anniversary of Operation Valkyrie, and 3 months after German surrender, general elections were held in Britain. Winston Churchill, the man who had led the country through the Battle of Britain, who had inspired resistance when invasion seemed imminent, who had formed the alliance that defeated Nazism, was decisively defeated. The Labour Party of Clement Attlee won with an overwhelming majority of 146 seats. Churchill, undisputed war hero, lost power not through conspiracy or bomb, but through popular vote. And he accepted it. There was no coup attempt, no declaration of emergency, no arrests of opposition. Churchill simply handed over the office to Attlee and became leader of the opposition. The British state continued functioning without interruption. The government machinery did not need Churchill to exist, because it was built on institutions, not personalities. This is the fundamental difference between democracy and dictatorship. Democracies tolerate leadership change because power is institutionally distributed. Dictatorships concentrate power in a person, and when the person becomes an obstacle to national survival, the system has no mechanism to remove them except violence. And violence is an inefficient, brutal, and frequently unsuccessful mechanism for political change. 200 elite German officers tried for years to kill Hitler and failed, because the structure of totalitarianism is designed to prevent exactly that. Millions of Britons removed Churchill in weeks through pencil and paper. The efficiency disparity is scandalous. The lesson of Operation Valkyrie is not that Hitler was lucky. The lesson is that totalitarianism is a fundamentally fragile system disguised as strength. Post-war historians devoted decades trying to understand Valkyrie's significance. Ian Kershaw, Hitler's definitive biographer, wrote in 2008, "If Operation Valkyrie had succeeded, the war would have ended months earlier. Millions of lives would have been spared. German soldiers, German civilians, concentration camp victims, Allied soldiers. Germany would not have been divided, and the Cold War configuration could have been fundamentally different. A wooden table and 2 centimeters determined Europe's fate for 50 years. The phrase resonates because it captures the brutal arbitrariness of history when it depends on assassination instead of institutions." Joachim Fest, another prominent German historian, argued that the July 20th conspirators represented the other Germany, the Germany of Prussian tradition, aristocratic values, sense of duty to state above leader. But that Germany had been systematically destroyed by Nazi totalitarianism that demanded loyalty to person, not principle. The conspirators tried to restore the notion that military officers served the nation, not the dictator. But the system they had allowed to be built had made that distinction obsolete. In the Nazi Reich, nation was Hitler, and Hitler was nation. There was no separation, and when they tried to separate the two, they were crushed by the machine they had helped create. Executions of July conspirators continued until April 1945, literally days before the Reich collapsed. Hitler, hiding in a bunker in Berlin with the Red Army meters away, still ordered executions of traitors while his empire crumbled. Admiral Canaris was hanged on April 9th. Theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged the same day. These were the Third Reich's last political executions. 3 weeks later, Hitler shot himself. The irony is inescapable. The man who had survived Operation Valkyrie by pure chance, who had executed thousands for trying to remove him, finally did the job himself, but only when Berlin was in flames and defeat was inescapable. If he had allowed himself to be removed 9 months earlier, millions would have lived. But totalitarianism does not permit such pragmatism. It demands absolute loyalty unto total self-destruction. This is its defining characteristic and its fatal flaw. Modern Germany treats July 20th conspirators as national heroes. The Bendler block, where Stauffenberg was shot, is now a memorial. Streets, schools, and military barracks bear conspirators' names. Every July 20th, German authorities lay wreaths and make speeches honoring men the Nazi regime executed as traitors. Because post-war Germany understood the fundamental lesson. The true traitors were not those who tried to save the country from suicidal leadership, but those who blindly obeyed until apocalyptic end. German resistance tried to give Germany what democracies inherently possess, the capacity for course correction. And they were destroyed for trying. This is Valkyrie's historical tragedy. But it is also an enduring lesson. Political systems that do not tolerate dissent, that do not permit peaceful leadership change, that demand personality cult instead of loyalty to institutions, inevitably become self-destruction machines. Totalitarianism contains its own annihilation because it confuses strength with rigidity, and rigidity is disguised fragility. In post-war interrogations, surviving German officers were questioned about why the Wehrmacht could not remove Hitler when it became clear he was destroying Germany. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, responded with surprising frankness. "We built a system where personal loyalty to the Führer replaced loyalty to the state. We swore loyalty not to Germany, but to Hitler. And when Hitler became Germany's enemy, we discovered we had become incapable of distinguishing the two. Totalitarianism had made us blind to the difference between serving a leader and serving a nation. Valkyrie was a desperate attempt to restore that distinction. It failed by centimeters, and Germany paid with its existence." This confession captures the tragedy's essence. German officers were not cowards or incompetent. They were products of a system that had systematically destroyed their capacity to act morally when morality required disobedience. Nazi totalitarianism had spent years conditioning the Wehrmacht to obey without question. And when the moment came that national survival required disobedience, the psychological mechanism no longer existed. 200 officers tried to break that conditioning. Most were hanged with piano wire for trying. The final contrast that defines Valkyrie's legacy is mathematical and brutal. Britain removed Churchill in 1945 through elections. Time required, weeks of campaigning and 1 day of voting. Cost in lives, 0. Efficiency, absolute. Germany tried to remove Hitler through secret conspiracy and bomb. Time required, 6 years of planning, 16 prior attempts, infiltration at command's highest levels. Cost in lives, approximately 5,000 executed in reprisals, plus 2 to 3 million killed in the 9 additional months of war after failure. Efficiency, 0. Hitler died by suicide, not conspiracy. This disparity does not reflect German incompetence or British superiority. It reflects a fundamental structural difference between democracy and dictatorship. Democracies distribute power through institutions and processes that can function independently of personalities. Dictatorships concentrate power in individuals and personality cults. And when the individual becomes the problem, the entire system becomes the problem. There is no correction mechanism, only violence or total collapse. Operation Valkyrie, in its essence, was an attempt by 200 German officers to give totalitarian Germany what democratic societies possess as a basic right: the ability to change incompetent leadership without destroying the state structure. They failed not for lack of courage, planning, or sacrifice, but because they tried to apply a democratic solution to a totalitarian problem using totalitarian tools. bomb instead of vote, conspiracy instead of debate, assassination instead of election. Totalitarianism had forced them to this and then destroyed them for trying. The lesson remains 81 years later. Any political system that makes peaceful leadership change impossible makes violent change inevitable. And violent change rarely comes when needed, where needed, or as needed. It comes when it comes too late and costing everything. Hitler survived Valkyrie by luck, 2 centimeters of oak and a meeting location change. But Germany had no such luck. It paid for a political system that made course correction structurally impossible with total destruction, half-century division, and a legacy of shame that endures today. This is totalitarianism's brutal arithmetic, rigidity disguised as strength, personality cult disguised as national unity, and guaranteed self-destruction disguised as glorious destiny. Operation Valkyrie was an attempt to escape that arithmetic. A wooden table ensured it failed. And millions died in the mathematics that followed.